I can still remember the smell of antiseptic from the transit ship, that clean chemical burn that seemed like such a promise. 14 years of study at the Schola Medicae on Vostroya, another 6 in the orbital hospitals above the forges, and I thought I understood what it meant to mend broken flesh. I thought the Munitorum had selected me for frontline duty because of my skill, my steady hands, my exemplary record with reconstructive surgery after industrial accidents. The transfer orders had been specific. Specialized skills required for extended campaign sustainability with the 47th Karelian Guard, Dathosian Front. I remember feeling proud, useful, chosen. The smell of that antiseptic lasted exactly 3 hours after landfall. Dathos III was a hive world in rebellion, and the war had been grinding through its under-cities for 18 months when I arrived. The briefing was perfunctory. Commissar Wolf, who would be attached to our Medicae section, gave me the essential information in a transport chimera that rattled across shell-pocked ferrocrete. Casualty rates ran at 40% per engagement. Supply lines were stretched. The rebels fought with a fanaticism that suggested chaos taint, though it hadn't been confirmed. My predecessor had suffered a nervous collapse and been transferred to rear echelon duties. The commissar watched me as she relayed this last detail, her augmetic left eye whirring as it focused. "You'll do better," she said. It wasn't encouragement. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who would ensure compliance. The field hospital was a converted warehouse in what had been an industrial zone before the shelling started. Rockcrete walls 3 meters thick, ceiling high enough to accommodate the mobile surgical theaters we'd hauled in on heavy lifters. The triage station occupied the main floor, 200 beds in neat rows, most of them occupied. The smell hit me before I'd crossed the threshold. Blood, yes. That copper-sharp scent I knew from training. But underneath it something else. Infection, gangrene. The particular sweetness of flesh beginning to rot despite our best efforts. And something chemical, acrid, that made my sinuses burn. My chief Medicae was a woman named Korlov, 10 years my senior, with the sort of efficiency that comes from having performed the same motions 10,000 times. She showed me the operating theaters, 3 of them, running in constant rotation. She showed me the supply lockers, already running low on antibiotics and synth skin. She showed me the recovery ward, and the shrouded section at the back where we kept those we couldn't save until the corpse detail came through. "You'll work 12-hour shifts," she said, her voice flat with exhaustion that had calcified into routine. "Sometimes longer during major pushes. We don't have anesthetists, so you'll be working with basic nerve blocks and sedatives. Half the soldiers come in so shock-traumatized they don't feel it anyway. The ones who do," she shrugged, "they learn to bite down." I asked about success rates. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in her expression I couldn't quite name. "You save who you can," she said. "The rest you make comfortable, if supplies allow. The Emperor protects, but we're his instruments. Sometimes the instrument breaks." That first week, I thought I could maintain the distance I'd been taught. Clinical observation, diagnostic precision. Each wounded soldier was a puzzle to solve, a body to repair according to the principles laid out in the sacred texts of anatomical knowledge. Las burns were straightforward: cauterize, seal, synth skin if available, bandages if not. Shrapnel wounds required extraction, debridement, prayer to the Emperor for guidance. The real challenge came with the complex trauma. Soldiers caught in building collapses, crushed beneath fallen machinery, their bones shattered into fragments that had to be painstakingly reconstructed. I was good at it. My hands didn't shake, my incisions were clean. When I worked, I could retreat into the technical requirements of the task, the pure problem of making broken flesh whole again. It was on the 8th day that I first noticed the violet stamps. A soldier came in with his left arm nearly severed at the shoulder, las fire having burned through muscle and bone until only a strip of skin held the limb attached. Standard procedure would have been amputation save what we could, get him stable, ship him back to have a basic augmetic fitted at some rear echelon facility. But when I opened his file, there was a small violet stamp in the corner of his identification papers, just a mark, really, a kind of Gothic V, with a serial number beneath it. Korlov saw me looking. "That one goes to Theater 3, she said. "His arm's unsalvageable," I said. "Better to amputate. Prevent infection." "Theater 3, she repeated. "Commissar's orders." I should have pressed. I should have demanded an explanation. But I was 8 days into frontline duty, running on stimulants and the particular exhaustion that comes from cutting into human flesh for 12 hours at a stretch, and I simply nodded. Theater 3 was the one I hadn't been assigned to yet. Korlov handled all the cases that went there, and now that I thought about it, I realized I'd never seen any of those patients in recovery. Theater 3 had a peculiar smell, that same acrid chemical burn I'd noticed on arrival, but concentrated. When I brought the soldier in, Korlov was already prepping, and she moved with a different kind of precision than I'd seen before. Not the efficient brutality of field surgery, but something almost ritualistic. She had instruments I didn't recognize, their purposes obscure. "You'll assist," she said. It wasn't a question. What we did to that soldier, what she taught me to do, wasn't reconstructive surgery. We took the damaged arm, yes, but instead of simply removing it, we preserved it, clamped the major vessels, injected something that made the flesh go rigid and gray, then carefully extracted the bone fragments and replaced them with a kind of lattice framework made from a polymer I'd never encountered in medical training. The smell of cauterization filled the theater, that specific scent of burning flesh that would become so horribly familiar. "What is this?" I asked, watching as she reconnected nerves to the polymer framework with thread, so fine it was almost invisible. "Sustainability," she said. "The 47th Karelian has been in continuous combat for 18 months. Casualty rates would have rendered them combat ineffective within 6. This is how we maintain operational strength." The soldier survived the procedure. We stabilized him, administered a cocktail of drugs I didn't recognize from standard Munitorum medical supplies, and transferred him to a sealed section of the hospital I'd been told was storage. When I tried to check on him the next day, the guards at the door, not Medicae staff, but actual armed soldiers, turned me away. "Restricted area," one said. "Commissar's authorization required." I found Commissar Volth in her small office adjacent to the main triage floor. She looked up from her data slate when I entered, that augmetic eye clicking as it refocused. "I want to know what we did to that soldier," I said. She set down the slate. "You performed a medical procedure under the direction of your superior officer in service to the God Emperor and the continued prosecution of this campaign. That's all you need to know. That wasn't standard reconstructive surgery. That polymer framework, those drugs, are classified medical technologies, approved for use by the Departamento Munitorum under emergency wartime provisions." Her human eye remained fixed on me while the augmetic swiveled slightly, as if examining me from multiple angles simultaneously. "You will continue to perform such procedures as required. Your predecessor refused. He is now performing bedpan duties at a rear echelon casualty clearing station, with a notation in his permanent record that will ensure he never practices medicine above that level again. Do you understand?" I understood. "In the Imperium, you serve where you're placed, how you're directed. To refuse is to invite not just punishment, but the absolute destruction of everything you've worked for. My hands, my skills, my years of training, all of it would mean nothing if I was branded as unreliable." "I understand," I said. "Good." She picked up her data slate again, dismissing me. "There will be more violet-stamped cases tomorrow. Major push scheduled for dawn. Expect heavy casualties." The major push came as promised. The 47th Karelian advanced into Hive Section Gamma 7, and the rebels met them with everything they had. The casualties started arriving before noon, so many that we abandoned any pretense of organized triage and simply worked on whoever was closest. Las burns, shrapnel wounds, crushed limbs, punctured lungs. The smell of blood became so thick it seemed to coat the inside of my throat, mixing with that ever-present chemical burn. I worked until my hands cramped, until I was performing incisions on muscle memory alone. A soldier with his jaw blown off, I couldn't save the bone structure, so I removed the shattered fragments and packed the wound, knowing he'd never speak properly again. A woman with her intestines exposed by an explosion, I pushed them back inside, sutured what I could, pumped her full of antibiotics we couldn't spare, and knew she'd probably die of sepsis within the week. A man whose legs had been crushed beneath a fallen wall, both limbs had to come off, and we didn't have time for anything but the crudest amputation, severing through the femurs with a surgical saw while he screamed despite the sedatives. Through it all, there were violet stamps. Not many, perhaps 1 in every 20 cases, but they kept coming. Soldiers with injuries that should have been fatal, or at least crippling. And each time, Korlov would direct them to Theatre 3, and I would assist in procedures that weren't quite surgery, and weren't quite something else. We replaced bone with polymer frameworks. We injected chemical preservatives into damaged tissue, keeping it viable long past when it should have necrotized. We attached nerve clusters to synthetic interfaces, using techniques I'd never been taught. And when we were done, the soldiers went to that sealed ward, behind those guarded doors, and I never saw them in recovery. It was after a particularly brutal session, 16 hours straight, 7 violet stamp procedures, that I finally broke protocol. I waited until the night shift had settled in, until the hospital had achieved that peculiar quiet that comes in the small hours when even the dying seem to rest. Then I made my way to the sealed ward. The guards were gone. I learned later that this wasn't an oversight but a test. They wanted to see what I would do, whether curiosity or compliance would win out. The door was unlocked. Inside, the smell of cauterization was overwhelming, as if the very air had been burned and sealed. The ward was larger than I'd expected, stretching back into what must have been the warehouse's original storage area, and it was full. Rows of beds, just like in the main triage area, but the soldiers in them, they weren't quite soldiers anymore. The polymer frameworks we'd installed had continued to grow, spreading through their bodies like some kind of architectural vine. The man whose arm I'd worked on during my first violet stamp procedure was there, and the lattice structure had extended beyond the original limb, spreading across his chest and down his other arm in geometric patterns that seemed almost beautiful in their precision. The flesh around it had gone grey and rigid, like stone, but he was alive. His eyes tracked me as I approached, though he didn't speak. They were all alive, all of them breathing, their chests rising and falling with mechanical regularity. But the polymer had changed them, was still changing them. Some had frameworks that had replaced entire sections of their skeletal structure. Others had the synthetic interfaces we'd installed, spreading across their skin like circuit patterns, and all of them had that same grey rigidity creeping through their flesh, as if they were slowly being converted into something between human and statue. Remarkable, isn't it? I spun around. Korlov stood in the doorway, and in the dim light from the ward's lumens, she looked older than I'd realized. Or perhaps it was just exhaustion, the same weariness that I could feel settling into my own bones. What have we done to them? I asked. What we were ordered to do. What the Departamento Munitorum requires. She walked past me, between the rows of beds, trailing her fingers along the metal frames. Do you know what happens to a regiment that suffers too many casualties? They folded into another unit. The 47th Karelian ceases to exist. All the history, the honors, the battle standards gone. Administratum efficiency. These men are still combat effective. More so, actually. The polymer framework is stronger than bone. They don't feel pain the way they used to. They don't tire as quickly. And they can be repaired much more extensively than normal human tissue allows. She stopped at one bed, looking down at a soldier whose entire torso had been replaced by the grey, latticed structure. This one took a direct hit from a grenade 3 weeks ago, blew out his chest cavity. Under normal circumstances, he'd be dead. We rebuilt him. He'll be back in the line within the month. I felt something twist in my stomach, a nausea that had nothing to do with the smell. This isn't medical care. This is sustainability, Korlov interrupted. I told you that on your first day. The regiment must be maintained. The Emperor protects, but we are his instruments, and sometimes the instrument must be adapted. I looked at the rows of beds, the rows of soldiers slowly transforming into something else. How long? I asked. How long before they're more polymer than flesh? Does it matter? They serve. They fight. They die for the Emperor, just as they always would have. We've simply made them more durable in the process. She turned to face me fully. You can leave, you know. Request a transfer. Commissar Valth won't stop you. But you'll never practice medicine again, and everything you've learned here will be classified at a level that ensures your silence. Or you can accept that this is necessary work. Ugly, yes. Disturbing, absolutely. But necessary. The Imperium is vast, and it is dying by inches. Every world lost to xenos or chaos. Every regiment destroyed. Every skilled Medicae who refuses to do what must be done, these are inches surrendered. We hold the line here. We keep the 47th Karelian combat effective. We serve. I should have refused. I should have demanded transfer, accepted the destruction of my career, maintained whatever moral high ground I thought I possessed, but I was 23 years old, and I had spent 2/3 of my life learning to mend broken flesh, and the thought of being reduced to emptying bedpans in some rear echelon facility for the rest of my existence. I'll stay, I said. Korlov nodded, as if she'd never doubted it. Good. There's a resupply shipment arriving tomorrow. New polymer stocks, updated neural interface components. I'll show you the advanced procedures. The advanced procedures were worse. We learned to anticipate injuries, to pre-install polymer frameworks in soldiers we deemed high risk. A Vox operator who'd be targeted by enemy snipers received reinforcement around his skull and spine before he ever took a shot. Heavy weapons teams got enhanced skeletal structures that could bear the weight of their equipment without the usual muscular strain. Officers received the most extensive modifications, not just physical reinforcement, but neural interfaces that connected directly to their tactical cogitators, allowing them to process battlefield information at speeds human cognition couldn't match. The violet stamps multiplied. What had been 1 in 20 became 1 in 10, then 1 in 5. The sealed ward expanded, taking over more of the warehouse, and the guards at the door became a permanent fixture. Commissar Valth visited regularly, reviewing our work with that augmetic eye, recording everything for reports I was never cleared to read, and the smell of cauterization became so constant that I stopped noticing it. Or perhaps I simply stopped being able to smell anything else. We worked. Emperor, how we worked. 12-hour shifts became 14, then 16. Then I lost track entirely of when I slept and when I operated. There was always another violet-stamped case, always another soldier who needed to be modified, enhanced, made sustainable. My hands developed a tremor from the constant micro-incisions required for neural interface installation. But I learned to work through it. Korlov taught me the prayers that were supposed to accompany each procedure, the invocations to the machine god that the tech priests had approved for our use, though we had no actual mechanicus authorization for what we were doing. Months blurred together. The war ground on. The 47th Karelian took casualties, and we rebuilt them. They took more casualties, and we rebuilt them again. Soldiers who should have died 3 times over kept fighting, their bodies more polymer than flesh, their nervous systems rewired through synthetic interfaces, their capacity for pain and fear and doubt gradually eroded by the chemical cocktails we injected with every procedure. I stopped thinking of them as patients. They became projects, problems to solve. The man with the shattered pelvis was a structural reinforcement challenge. The woman whose lungs had been seared by chemical weapons became an opportunity to test new respiratory augmentation protocols. The teenage conscript whose face had been burned off by promethium allowed me to practice advanced synthetic skin grafting techniques that would have been impossible with normal tissue. It was efficient. It was necessary. It was what the Imperium required. It was also the slow death of whatever part of me had wanted to heal. I realized this during one of the rare quiet periods, a lull in the fighting that gave us time to catch up on maintenance procedures. I was reviewing case files, cross-referencing survival rates and combat effectiveness data, when I found myself thinking of the soldiers not as people but as units, resources to be optimized. The terminology had crept into my thoughts without my noticing. We didn't save lives anymore, we maintained operational capacity. We didn't treat injuries, we corrected deficiencies. We didn't perform surgery, we executed enhancement protocols. Korlov found me in the records room, staring at the files. "It gets easier," she said. "Does it?" "No." She sat down across from me, and I saw that her hands shook worse than mine did. "But you learn to function anyway. You learn to separate the work from what the work means. You learn to sleep despite knowing what you've done. Or you don't learn, and you end up like our predecessor, curled up in a corner somewhere weeping for the Emperor's mercy. How long have you been doing this?" 4 years. 3 different regiments before the 47th Karelian. It's always the same. Different polymer compounds, different enhancement protocols, but the same fundamental principle. We keep the regiment combat effective. We serve. At what cost? She looked at me with something that might have been pity. Does the cost matter? We're cogs in a machine so vast we can't comprehend its full scope. The Imperium needs soldiers. We provide them. Whether they're flesh or polymer or something in between, the Emperor doesn't care, and neither should we. But I did care. That was the horrible truth I couldn't escape, even as I performed the procedures, even as I installed polymer frameworks and neural interfaces with increasing skill and efficiency. Some part of me still registered that these were people, that they had been people, before we got our hands on them, that with each modification, each enhancement, each improvement to their combat effectiveness, we were taking something away from them that could never be returned. The worst were the ones who came back for additional procedures. Soldiers we'd modified once, who'd returned to combat, taken more damage, and come back for further enhancement. Each time, there was less human flesh to work with. Each time, the polymer spread further. Each time, their eyes became a little more distant, their responses a little more mechanical. There was a sergeant named Drell who became my personal nightmare. First time I worked on him, it was a standard arm replacement. Last fire had destroyed the limb below the elbow. Simple polymer framework, basic neural interface. He thanked me afterward, his voice still human, still warm. Second time, 3 months later, he'd taken shrapnel through his left leg and lower torso. More extensive work, but he survived. The polymer had spread to about 30% of his body mass. He didn't thank me this time, just nodded and returned to duty. Third time, I barely recognized him. An artillery shell had detonated close enough to pulp most of his right side. We rebuilt him over a period of 6 hours, installing so much polymer framework that he was more synthetic than biological. His speech had become clipped, mechanical. His eyes didn't focus the way human eyes should. Fourth time, there wasn't much left to save. Battle damage had destroyed most of his remaining organic tissue, but the polymer was still intact, still functional, still capable of supporting combat operations. So we did what we'd been trained to do. We removed what little flesh remained and completed his conversion. When we were done, Sergeant Drell was approximately 94% polymer framework and synthetic interfaces. His brain remained organic, though we'd installed enhancement shunts that connected it to tactical processors. His major organs had been replaced with synthetic equivalents. His skin was a thin layer of vat-grown tissue stretched over the grey lattice structure. He stood up from the operating table under his own power, movements fluid and precise in a way that no human body should move. "Operational," he said, his voice synthesized through a mechanical larynx, returning to active duty. Korlov marked him as combat ready. Commissar Valth approved the classification, and Sergeant Drell walked out of Theater 3 and back to the front lines, where he would continue to serve the Emperor with optimal efficiency. I vomited in a waste receptacle afterward, the first time I'd shown such weakness in months. Korlov pretended not to notice. That night, I dreamed of polymer frameworks spreading through my own body, grey lattices replacing my bones, synthetic interfaces threading through my nervous system. I woke up gasping, my hands clutching at my own flesh to confirm it was still entirely mine. It was. For now. The next day brought a new directive from the Departamento Munitorum, delivered via encrypted Vox by Commissar Valth. The 47th Karelian's success rate had been noted at higher command levels. Other regiments were requesting similar enhancement programs. We were to train additional Medicae staff in our procedures. They arrived within the week, 5 Medicae Surgeons pulled from various other units, all of them showing the same mix of skill and naivete that I remembered from my own arrival. Korlov and I divided them up, each of us taking 2 for training while we shared the 5th. We taught them the procedures, the prayers, the particular way to install polymer frameworks so they'd interface properly with human nervous systems. We showed them the sealed ward, the rows of modified soldiers, the future we were building one enhanced soldier at a time. 3 of them adapted. 2 requested transfer. Commissar Valth shot one of the transfer requests in the head right there in the triage area, her bolt pistol reducing his skull to fragments that splattered across the nearest operating table. "The work is classified," she said calmly, holstering her weapon. "Transfer is not an option. Adaptation or death. Choose." The 5th Medicae chose adaptation. We expanded. New theaters were constructed. New wards sealed off. The polymer supplies increased, and with them came updated protocols, improved neural interface designs, chemical cocktails that could sustain even more extensive modifications. The war continued, and the 47th Karelian continued to take casualties, and we continued to rebuild them into something that could keep fighting. I stopped counting the procedures, stopped remembering the faces. They all blurred together into a continuous stream of broken flesh that needed to be reinforced, optimized, made sustainable. My hands moved through the motions with practiced efficiency, incision, debridement, polymer installation, neural interface threading, suturing, chemical injection, prayer to the machine god, transfer to recovery. Next patient. Repeat. The smell of cauterization was everything. I woke with it in my nostrils. I tasted it with every meal. It saturated my clothing, my skin, my hair. Sometimes I thought I could smell it burning through my own flesh, as if the polymer we installed in others was somehow spreading to me through proximity alone. It was during my 8th month on Dathos 3 that I discovered the regeneration ward, the sealed ward I'd found on my 2nd week that was just recovery, a place where the modified soldiers stabilized before returning to duty. But there was another section, deeper in the warehouse complex, that I'd never been cleared to access. Even Korlov didn't have authorization. Only Commissar Valth and a select few tech priests who visited monthly went inside. I learned about it by accident. A violet-stamped patient had complications during a procedure. His body was rejecting the polymer framework we'd installed, immune response going haywire despite the immunosuppressants. Standard protocol was to remove the framework and let him die, but Valth was observing that day, and she gave different orders. "Transfer to regeneration," she said. "His immune system will kill him before." Transfer to regeneration. Each word precise, clipped, leaving no room for argument. So we stabilized him as best we could and loaded him onto a gurney. Commissar Valth led the way personally, through corridors I'd never traveled, past security checkpoints manned by soldiers who didn't look quite right, too still, too precise in their movements, their eyes scanning with mechanical regularity. The regeneration ward was cold. Not just physically cold, though the temperature was maintained at near freezing levels, but cold in some deeper way that made my skin crawl. Banks of machinery lined the walls, all of it humming with a frequency I could feel in my teeth. And in the center, rows of tanks filled with a viscous amber fluid. Bodies floated in those tanks. Modified soldiers, but far more extensively converted than anything I'd seen in the regular sealed ward. Some were almost entirely polymer, just enough organic matter remaining to maintain the basic neural functions. Others were in intermediate states, the framework spreading through them in real time, visible through the amber fluid as it consumed flesh and replaced it with synthetic structure. "What is this?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "The next stage," Valth said. "Enhanced soldiers eventually suffer catastrophic failures. Organic tissue has limits, even when reinforced, so we've developed a solution." She gestured to the tanks. "Complete conversion. Full neural upload to synthetic frameworks. They retain tactical knowledge, combat experience, all the benefits of their training. But they're no longer limited by biological constraints." I stared at the tanks, at the things floating inside them. They're not human anymore. They never needed to be. They needed to be effective. These are the most effective soldiers the Imperium has ever produced. She turned to me, that augmetic eye whirring. "Your patient will be placed in Regeneration Tank 7. His immune system will be systematically shut down as the conversion completes. Within 6 weeks, he'll return to active duty with a 98% synthetic body composition and complete tactical cognition intact. And his soul is the Emperor's, just as it always was." We left the patient floating in Tank 7, his body already beginning to change as the enhanced polymer solution worked its way through his system. I didn't ask any more questions. I was learning, slowly, that questions led to answers I couldn't live with. But the regeneration ward haunted me. I thought about it constantly, those tanks, those floating bodies, the mechanical hum of the conversion process. And I thought about Sergeant Drell, who'd been 94% converted when he left my operating table. Had he ended up in one of those tanks? Was he still Sergeant Drell in any meaningful sense? Or just a collection of tactical data running on a synthetic framework? Did it matter? I was contemplating this question during a rare moment of downtime when Korlov sat down beside me. She looked worse than usual, her hands shaking so badly she had to clasp them together to keep them still. "I'm being transferred," she said. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Where?" "Rear echelon. Medical oversight for a training facility on Ophelia the 7th. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "A promotion, technically, for my exemplary service maintaining the 47th Karelian's combat effectiveness. That's good. They're removing me before I break. I'm too close to the edge, and they know it. Valth knows it, so they're rotating me out, putting me somewhere I can't do damage." She looked at me, and her eyes were hollow. "You're being promoted. Chief Medicae for the enhancement program. Full authority over procedures and protocols. I don't want. What you want is irrelevant. You're skilled. You're efficient. You don't ask questions anymore. You're perfect for the role." She was right. I had stopped asking questions. I'd learned to perform the procedures without thinking about what they meant, to install polymer frameworks and neural interfaces with the same detached precision I'd once used for appendectomies. I'd adapted. I'd survived. I'd become exactly what the system needed me to be. Korlov left the next day. I didn't say goodbye. I'm not sure what I would have said if I had. My promotion came with expanded authority and access. I could now visit the regeneration ward whenever necessary. I could request specialized equipment and chemical compounds. I could make decisions about which soldiers received which level of modification, who went to standard recovery, and who went to the tanks. I could also access the full archive of medical records for the enhancement program. I shouldn't have looked. Some small, still functioning part of my conscience knew that diving into those records would show me things I couldn't unknow. But curiosity or guilt or some toxic mixture of both, drove me to the data terminals late one night, accessing files I'd never been cleared to read. The program was older than I'd realized. Much older. The 47th Karelian wasn't the first regiment to receive enhancement protocols. Wasn't even the 10th. The Departamento Munitorum had been running variations of this program for nearly 2 centuries, refining techniques, improving polymer compounds, developing better neural interfaces, and the success rate was measured not in lives saved but in combat effectiveness maintained. Regiments that should have been destroyed kept fighting. Soldiers who should have died continued serving. The cost in humanity was never calculated. Or if it was, those figures were buried so deep I couldn't find them. I found Korlov's record. She'd been Chief Medicae for 4 years, as she'd said, but before that, she'd been a patient, modified during her own frontline service, enhanced to survive wounds that should have killed her, eventually retired from combat and retrained as medical staff because her hands had become too damaged for frontline duty, but her surgical precision had actually improved after polymer installation in her nervous system. I found records of the regeneration ward's true purpose. It wasn't just for soldiers whose bodies rejected the enhancements. It was the final destination for all of them. Eventually, every modified soldier would, given enough time and damage, reach a point where organic tissue could no longer be maintained. The polymer would spread, the conversion would complete, and they would join the others in the tanks, becoming fully synthetic soldiers who could fight indefinitely, who felt no pain or fear or doubt, who served the Emperor with perfect mechanical efficiency. I found my own record. It was flagged with a violet stamp. I sat there in the cold glow of the data terminal, staring at my file, at the notation that had been added during my second week on Dathos 3. Subject demonstrates necessary adaptability. Preliminary enhancement approved upon demonstration of procedural proficiency. Long-term conversion projected at 78% probability. They'd been planning this from the beginning. My transfer to the 47th Karelian hadn't been about my surgical skills. It had been about my profile, my psychological markers, the assessments that suggested I would adapt to the work rather than break under it. I was being tested, evaluated, prepared for my own eventual enhancement. I checked the dates on my file, checked when I was scheduled for routine medical evaluation, 3 weeks from now, and I knew, with cold certainty, what that evaluation would find. Some condition that required immediate intervention, some injury or illness that just happened to be perfectly suited for polymer framework installation, some necessary modification that would begin my own conversion process. I could have run, could have tried to disappear into the hive city's ruins, blend in with the civilian population, vanish before the evaluation date arrived. But where would I go? The Imperium was everywhere. My medical credentials were in the system. My face was on file. My skills were too valuable to simply lose. And part of me, the part that had adapted, that had learned to function despite knowing what I was doing, part of me was almost curious. Would it be so bad, really? To be enhanced? To have steady hands that never trembled, nerves that could be rewired for perfect precision, a body that could endure the constant strain of surgical work without deterioration? Wouldn't that make me better at the necessary work? I closed the file, shut down the terminal, walked back to my quarters through corridors that smelled perpetually of cauterization. The next day, I performed 7 enhancement procedures with flawless efficiency. The day after that, 9. The day after that, I stopped counting. The weeks blurred. The evaluation date approached. I didn't run. I didn't request transfer. I didn't do anything except work, because work was all that mattered. Work was sustainable. Work was necessary. Work was what the Imperium required. Commissar Valth came to find me 3 days before the scheduled evaluation. She didn't say anything at first, just watched me complete a polymer framework installation on a soldier whose entire spine had been shattered. When I finished, she nodded toward her office. "You accessed your medical file," she said once the door was sealed. Not a question. A statement of fact. Yes, I said. And I understand. She leaned back in her chair, that augmetic eye studying me. Most subjects panic when they learn. Try to flee. We have to accelerate their conversion, install compliance protocols to prevent them from damaging themselves or compromising security. But you're different. You accept. I adapt, I corrected. Like you knew I would. Yes, like we knew you would. She pulled up a hololithic display, showing my psychological profile, the markers that had flagged me as suitable for the enhancement program. Highly skilled, intensely focused on professional competency, strong need for purpose, low attachment to conventional social bonds, history of subordinating personal needs to institutional requirements, perfect candidate, for conversion, for service, enhanced service. Your skills will be preserved, improved, made sustainable. You'll be able to perform procedures for decades, centuries even, without the degradation that plagues unmodified medical staff. You'll serve the Emperor far more effectively than you ever could in your current form. I thought about the tanks in the regeneration ward, about the floating bodies, the mechanical hum, the slow transformation from flesh to polymer, about Sergeant Drell and all the others I'd helped convert, unknowing that I was preparing the same fate for myself. When? I asked. The evaluation will identify complications in your nervous system. Stress-induced degradation from extended surgical work. Will recommend preliminary enhancement polymer threading along major nerve clusters. Synthetic interfaces to stabilize your fine motor control. Standard procedure for medical staff operating in extended combat zones, and then it spreads, gradually, over months, years. Each additional enhancement makes the next one necessary, and the next, until eventually, the tanks. Service eternal, Volth said, and there might have been something almost gentle in her voice. No more exhaustion, no more doubt, no more hands that shake from overwork, just pure, perfect function, serving the Emperor as his tools were meant to serve. I should have felt horror, should have raged against it, refused, demanded my rights as an Imperial citizen to bodily autonomy. But I was so tired, tired of the work, tired of the guilt, tired of the constant knowledge of what I was doing to others, and the promise of that tiredness ending, of becoming something that didn't feel or doubt or question. Will I remember? I asked. When the conversion completes, will I remember who I was? Does it matter? You'll remember your skills, your knowledge, everything necessary for your function. The rest, she shrugged. The rest is weight you'll be better off without. The evaluation went exactly as predicted. Complications in my nervous system, stress-induced damage, recommendation for immediate intervention. I lay on the operating table in theater, my own theater, where I'd performed hundreds of enhancement procedures and felt the cold kiss of the sedative entering my bloodstream. The Medicae performing my procedure was one of the ones I'd trained. She was skilled, efficient. She'd learned well. Her hands didn't shake as she made the first incision along my spine, exposing the neural clusters that would receive the polymer threading. I felt the polymer enter my nervous system like ice water spreading through channels, felt it wrap around my nerves, synthetic interfaces clicking into place with minute precision, felt something fundamental about my body change, becoming less flesh and more framework. The pain was extraordinary. The sedatives couldn't fully block it. The nervous system has to be conscious for the synthetic interfaces to properly integrate. So I felt everything. The threading spreading, the connections being made, the slow, inexorable process of my body being prepared for its own eventual conversion. And through the pain, I felt something else. Relief. This was what I'd done to others. Now it was being done to me. There was a kind of justice in that, a balance. I'd adapted to performing the procedures. Now I would adapt to receiving them. I'd learned to function despite the guilt. Now I would be freed from the capacity for guilt entirely. The procedure took 6 hours. When it was complete, I stood up from the table and felt the difference immediately. My hands didn't shake anymore. The tremors that had developed from months of constant surgical work were gone, the polymer framework stabilizing my nervous system with perfect precision. My vision seemed sharper, my thoughts clearer. My body felt lighter, more responsive, optimized. I looked down at my hands and saw the faint gray lines beneath the skin where the polymer had threaded through. Just the beginning, just the first enhancement, but I could feel it there, waiting, ready to spread, ready to convert. I returned to work the next day, performed 12 enhancement procedures with flawless efficiency. My hands moved with perfect precision, the polymer framework in my nervous system eliminating any trace of hesitation or error. The patients survived at rates higher than I'd ever achieved before. Commissar Volth approved my performance evaluation, recommended me for additional enhancement, scheduled my next procedure for 3 months out. The work continued. The war ground on. The 47th Carillion took casualties and we rebuilt them. They took more casualties and we rebuilt them again. Soldiers went into the operating theaters as flesh and emerged as something in between. Soldiers went into the regeneration tanks as something in between and emerged as something else entirely. And I worked. Enhanced. Optimized. Made sustainable. My second procedure added polymer framework to my skeletal structure, reinforcement around my spine and ribs, stability enhancements that would allow me to work longer hours without physical strain. The gray lines beneath my skin spread, visible networks of synthetic material threading through my body. My third procedure installed neural processors that interfaced directly with my enhanced nervous system. Tactical cognition improvement, they called it. The ability to process multiple surgical variables simultaneously, to visualize complex procedures in complete detail before making the first incision. My hands stopped feeling entirely human. They moved with mechanical precision, responding to thought faster than biological nerves should allow. I could perform procedures I'd once found impossible, installations so complex they required absolute stability and focus beyond human capacity. I was becoming very good at my work, better than human, really. The months accumulated. The procedures continued. Each enhancement made the next one necessary, just as Valth had said. The polymer spread through my body in geometric patterns, replacing bone and nerve, and eventually organ tissue with synthetic equivalents. I could feel myself changing, could sense the slow transformation from flesh to framework. I didn't resist. Resistance was inefficient. Resistance served no purpose. I served. 13 months after my first enhancement, I visited the regeneration ward and looked at the tanks with different eyes. I could see the logic in them now. The pure efficiency. Flesh was temporary, prone to failure, limited by biological constraints, but polymer was eternal. Synthetic systems could be repaired indefinitely. A soldier converted to 98% synthetic composition could serve for centuries, couldn't they? Could fight in campaign after campaign, their tactical knowledge accumulating, their combat effectiveness increasing, could perform surgical procedures without exhaustion, without doubt, without the weight of conscience slowing their hands. 18 months after my first enhancement, I was promoted again. Chief Medical Officer for the entire Dathosian front, overseeing enhancement programs for 5 separate regiments. The polymer had spread to approximately 60% of my body mass. My thought processes had accelerated, enhanced by the neural processors wired into my brain. I could manage multiple operating theaters simultaneously, monitoring procedures through data feed interfaces, making split-second decisions that optimized outcomes across dozens of concurrent cases. I was exceptional at my work. I was also barely human anymore. Korloff sent me a message from Ophelia 7th. Brief. Clinical. She'd heard about my promotion. Congratulated me on my success. Added a single line at the end. I hope you find what you're looking for. I didn't respond. I'm not sure I understood what she meant. What I was looking for had been found months ago. Purpose, function, the elimination of doubt, through the simple expedient of removing the capacity for it. 22 months after my first enhancement, I was scheduled for evaluation. Full body scan, cognitive assessment, psychological review, standard procedure for modified medical staff approaching critical conversion thresholds. I knew what they would find, what they were designed to find, that I'd reached the point where organic tissue could no longer be adequately maintained, that full conversion was necessary, that my consciousness should be uploaded to synthetic frameworks and my body committed to the regeneration tanks for final processing. I wasn't afraid. Fear required emotional capacity I no longer possessed. The polymer had spread through my limbic system, my amygdala, the portions of my brain responsible for processing emotion. I could recognize fear as a concept, understand it intellectually, but I couldn't feel it anymore. I couldn't feel much of anything anymore. Commissar Valve conducted the evaluation personally. She was older now, or perhaps I simply noticed her aging, because my own body had stopped showing normal signs of deterioration. Her augmetic eye had been upgraded, and she moved with the slight stiffness that came from refusing her own enhancement procedures. She was entirely human still, entirely limited. 68% synthetic composition, she said, reading the scan results. Neural processors operating at 140% baseline efficiency. Cognitive function enhanced across all measured parameters. Emotional response severely degraded. Recommendation: proceed to full conversion within the next 6 months. Acknowledged, I said. My voice had changed, taken on a mechanical quality that matched the polymer threading through my larynx. You've served exemplarily, Volth continued. Your work has maintained combat effectiveness for 5 regiments. Your techniques have been adopted across 17 enhancement programs in 4 subsectors. You should be proud. One Comda, you be proud. Pride required emotional capacity. I noted her statement, filed it as relevant information, moved on. When? I asked. The next conversion cycle begins in 3 weeks. We'll schedule you for Tank 17. Full neural upload, complete synthetic conversion. You'll retain all surgical knowledge and tactical cognition. Everything else will be streamlined. Optimal, I said. She studied me with that augmetic eye, and for a moment, something flickered across her face. Regret? Sadness? I couldn't interpret human expressions as easily as I once had. The neural processors were better at tactical data than emotional nuance. You adapted, she said quietly, just like we knew you would. So completely that you adapted yourself out of existence. I didn't understand. I was still here, still functional, still serving, still me, in all the ways that mattered, wasn't I? 3 weeks later, I stood in the regeneration ward, looking at Tank 17. It was empty, waiting. The amber fluid circulated with mechanical precision, maintained at exactly the right temperature and chemical composition to support the conversion process. Around me, other tanks hummed with their floating occupants, bodies in various stages of transformation. I recognized some of them. Soldiers I'd enhanced, medical staff I'd trained, all of them becoming something else, something better, something more sustainable. I would join them, strip away the remaining scraps of flesh, upload my consciousness to the synthetic frameworks, complete the transformation I'd been undergoing for 2 years, become fully operational, fully effective, fully optimized, fully not human. I tried to feel something about this, tried to access whatever emotional capacity remained in my degraded limbic system, to experience fear or regret or even acceptance. But there was nothing. Just the calm recognition of optimal procedure. Just the understanding that this was necessary, efficient, correct. Just the work. The technicians arrived to begin the process. I lay down on the preparation table without resistance, let them attach the neural upload interfaces, the consciousness transfer apparatus, the polymer infusion lines that would complete my conversion. Let them activate the sequence. And as my consciousness began to fragment, preparing to upload into the synthetic frameworks, I had one final human thought. I had wanted to heal. That's what I'd trained for. What I'd spent years learning. The sacred calling of the Medicae, to mend broken flesh, to save lives, to preserve humanity in the face of suffering. Instead, I'd learned to transform humanity into something that couldn't suffer, couldn't break, couldn't die in ways that mattered, couldn't be human. And now I was following the same path, completing the same transformation, becoming the same thing I'd helped create in countless others. Sustainable, optimal, empty. The thought dissolved as the upload completed. My consciousness fragmented into data streams, uploading to synthetic neural networks that would preserve my surgical knowledge and tactical cognition while discarding everything else. Everything unnecessary. Everything that made me more than a tool. Everything that made me me. The tanks hummed. The polymer spread. The conversion completed. And somewhere in the depths of the regeneration ward, in Tank 17, a body floated in amber fluid. 98% synthetic. Fully operational. Ready to serve the Emperor with perfect mechanical efficiency for centuries to come. No doubt, no fear, no guilt, no humanity. Just the work. Just the work. Just the work. Forever. I tell you this now from that tank. My consciousness, running on synthetic frameworks. My thoughts processed through neural nets that barely remember what it meant to be entirely flesh. I tell you this as a warning, though I no longer possess the emotional capacity to understand why warnings matter. The Imperium needs soldiers. The Imperium needs Medicae. The Imperium needs those who will adapt, who will serve, who will do the necessary work, no matter the cost. And the cost is everything. Everything that makes us human. Everything that makes the work worth doing. Everything. The smell of cauterization is eternal here. It saturates the amber fluid, permeates the synthetic frameworks, threads through the neural networks that process what remains of my consciousness. I can't escape it. I can't escape anything. I am the work. The work is me. There is no distinction anymore. There is only service. Sustainable. Optimal. Forever. The Emperor protects, they say. But I wonder, and this wondering is perhaps the last fragment of my human consciousness, the last flicker, before it dissolves entirely. I wonder if the Emperor weeps for what we've become in his name. I wonder if he notices. I wonder if it matters. The polymer spreads. The tanks hum. The work continues. And I, who once wanted to heal, have become the sickness, perfect, eternal, lost.